The warm glow of sunset filtered through the living room windows as Mrs. Thompson, a gentle 68-year-old grandmother, settled into her favorite armchair. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, and her kind eyes sparkled as she flipped through a family photo album, smiling at memories of her children and grandchildren. The peaceful atmosphere of her well-kept suburban home wrapped around her like a comfortable blanket. She had just finished watering her prized roses in the front garden, something she did every evening without fail. Her neighbors often praised her for keeping the prettiest garden on the block. After 32 years in this house, she had turned it into a real home, filled with love and cherished memories. The grandfather clock in the corner, a wedding anniversary gift from her late husband, chimed 7 times. Mrs. Thompson had just picked up her cup of chamomile tea when a loud, aggressive knock shattered the evening calm. The sound was so forceful that it made her jump, causing a few drops of tea to spill onto her neat floral dress. Setting down her cup with slightly trembling hands, she made her way to the door. Through the peephole, she could see 2 police officers standing on her porch. Their postures were stiff, and their faces held none of the friendly expressions she was used to seeing on Officer Chen, who regularly patrolled their neighborhood. "Just a moment, officers," she called out, her voice steady despite her growing unease. She opened the door, keeping the security chain latched, a habit her son, a successful lawyer, had always insisted upon. The taller officer spoke first, his voice sharp and demanding. "Ma'am, we've received reports of suspicious activity in this area. We need to ask you some questions." Mrs. Thompson's heart began to race, but she kept her composure, just as she had done during her 40 years as a school teacher. "Officers, I've lived in this house for over 3 decades. I'm wondering what seems suspicious." The second officer cut in before she could finish her explanation. "Can you prove this is your residence?" His tone suggested he had already made up his mind about something, and Mrs. Thompson felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. She reached for her purse on the nearby console table, moving slowly and deliberately. "Of course, I have my identification right here. Would you like to see my utility bills as well? I keep them organized in my kitchen drawer." But the officers weren't interested in her careful record-keeping. They exchanged glances that made Mrs. Thompson's teacher instincts tingle, the same look she'd seen countless times when students were up to no good. "Ma'am, remove the chain and open the door completely," the first officer demanded, his hand moving to rest on his belt. Mrs. Thompson felt her chest tighten. This wasn't right. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She thought about her son's words during their Sunday dinner just last week. "Mom, you have rights. Don't let anyone make you forget that." Through the narrow gap in the door, she could see her neighbor Mrs. Rivera watching from across the street, phone in hand. The sight gave her a small measure of comfort. She wasn't alone, even if it felt that way. The evening breeze carried the scent of her roses through the gap in the door, but now instead of bringing peace, it carried tension. The same flowers that had earned her compliments just hours ago somehow seemed to have made her a target of suspicion. As the officers grew more insistent, Mrs. Thompson's hand moved slowly toward the medical alert pendant hidden beneath her collar. Her son had insisted she wear it after her mild heart scare last year. Who could have known it would come in handy for something like this? The peaceful evening had transformed into something entirely different, and Mrs. Thompson knew that what happened next would depend on keeping her wits about her. Years of handling rowdy students had taught her that sometimes the calmest voice could be the strongest one in the room. The situation at Mrs. Thompson's front door was quickly spinning out of control. Despite her calm demeanor, the officers' voices grew louder, echoing through the quiet suburban street. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her wallet, pulling out her driver's license and homeowner's insurance card. "See, officers, this is my home," she explained, her voice carrying the same patient tone she had used with generations of students. "I've lived here since 1991. That's my rose garden you're standing next to. I just finished tending to it before you arrived." The taller officer barely glanced at her documentation. "These could be fake," he said dismissively, causing Mrs. Thompson's heart to skip a beat. In all her years, no one had ever accused her of being dishonest. She had spent 4 decades teaching young minds the importance of truth and integrity. "I don't understand," she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I have more proof inside. My late husband's military medals are hanging in the study. There are family photos everywhere. I can show you our deed." The second officer cut her off. "Step outside, ma'am. We need to verify some things." His hand moved toward the door, as if he was considering pushing it open. Mrs. Thompson felt a chill run down her spine, but years of handling difficult classroom situations had taught her to stay composed. "Officers, I respectfully decline to step outside. I'm a law-abiding citizen in my own home. If you have probable cause or a warrant, please present it." Her neighbor, Mrs. Rivera, was now standing on her own porch, openly recording with her phone. Two other neighbors had emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Thompson could see Mr. Wilson, a retired judge, walking purposefully toward her house. The first officer's face hardened. "Ma'am, your presence in this neighborhood has been reported as suspicious. We have a duty to investigate." Mrs. Thompson felt her teacher's patience wearing thin. "Suspicious? I was watering my roses, officers. The same roses that won the Garden Club's award last spring. There's even a small write-up about them in last month's community newsletter." She could see the uncertainty flicker across the younger officer's face, but his partner pressed on. "We've had reports of break-ins in the area. You match a description we received." "A description?" Mrs. Thompson's voice took on the stern tone that had once silenced unruly classrooms. "You mean the description of an elderly grandmother in gardening clothes, tending to her roses? The same roses I've been growing for 3 decades. The medical alert pendant felt heavy against her chest, reminding her of her son's constant concern for her safety. He had insisted on the pendant after her mild heart scare, but now it might serve a different purpose entirely. Through the gap in the door, she could see more neighbors gathering. Mrs. Rivera had moved closer, her phone still recording. Mr. Wilson was now at the bottom of Mrs. Thompson's driveway, his authoritative presence drawing the officer's attention. The evening air had grown thick with tension. The sweet scent of roses now mixed with the metallic taste of fear in Mrs. Thompson's mouth. She thought of her son, remembering his words. "Mom, if anything ever feels wrong, if anyone ever makes you feel unsafe, even if they wear a badge, you call me immediately." The officers exchanged glances, perhaps noting the growing crowd of witnesses. The younger one shifted uncomfortably, but the older officer's stance remained aggressive. Mrs. Thompson's hand moved to her pendant, hidden beneath her cardigan. She knew the next few moments would be crucial. Years of teaching had taught her to read people, to understand when a situation was about to escalate. Right now, every instinct told her this confrontation was reaching a dangerous tipping point. The officer's body language, their dismissive tone, the way they positioned themselves, it all spoke of an encounter that could quickly turn frightening. But Mrs. Thompson wasn't alone. She could feel the support of her community gathering around her house. The same neighborhood where she had taught countless children, attended countless barbecues, and shared countless memories was now standing witness to this unsettling scene. Her fingers closed around the medical alert button as the older officer took a step forward. Sometimes, she thought, the bravest thing you can do is ask for help when you need it. And right now, Mrs. Thompson knew she needed her son's help more than ever. With trembling fingers but unwavering resolve, Mrs. Thompson pressed the small button on her medical alert pendant. She kept her other hand visible in the doorway, remembering her son's careful instructions about dealing with law enforcement. The pendant, usually a reminder of her age and vulnerability, now felt like a lifeline to safety. The older officer's voice grew more demanding. "Last chance, ma'am. Step outside, or we'll have to take necessary action." His hand rested meaningfully on his belt, a gesture that made Mrs. Thompson's heart race even faster. She thought quickly, drawing on decades of experience in handling tense situations as a teacher. That small button she'd pressed would set several things in motion. Not only would it alert emergency services, but it would also automatically send a notification to her son. As one of the city's most respected civil rights attorneys, he had insisted on being connected to her alert system. "Officers," she spoke clearly, but teacher's voice carrying across her front porch. "I want to cooperate, but I also want to feel safe. My neighbors are watching, and this interaction is being recorded." She nodded slightly toward Mrs. Rivera, who stood firmly with her phone raised. The younger officer glanced nervously at the growing crowd of neighbors. Mr. Wilson, the retired judge, had now moved closer, his presence adding another layer of witness to the scene. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mrs. Thompson could hear distant sirens, though she wasn't sure if they were heading her way. She thought about all the times she taught her students about civil rights and proper procedures. How many times has she explained the importance of knowing your rights while remaining respectful? Now, those lessons felt more real than ever. "I've already pressed my medical alert button," she informed the officers calmly. "My son, who happens to be an attorney, will be automatically notified. He's only 10 minutes away." She watched as the officers exchanged quick, uncertain glances. The sweet scent of her roses wafted through the evening air, a jarring contrast to the bitter situation unfolding on her doorstep. Her garden had always been her pride and joy, a place of peace and beauty. Now it was serving as the backdrop for this disturbing confrontation. More neighbors had gathered, their presence forming a protective circle of witness. Mrs. Thompson recognized the Henderson couple from across the street and the young family that had just moved in next door. All of them had their phones out, recording the scene. The younger officer shifted his weight uncomfortably. "Ma'am, we're just doing our job." There have been reports of an elderly grandmother gardening. Mr. Wilson's authoritative voice cut through the tension. "I've been watching Mrs. Thompson tend those roses for decades. This is harassment, plain and simple." Mrs. Thompson's hand remained steady on the doorframe. In her 32 years in this house, she'd never felt afraid until now. But she wasn't alone. Her community stood with her, and help was on the way. She could hear a car engine racing in the distance, the sound growing louder. She knew that sound, the distinctive purr of her son's car. He always drove fast when he was worried about her, and right now he had every reason to be concerned. The older officer must have heard it too. His posture changed slightly, becoming less aggressive but more alert. The younger one kept glancing down the street, perhaps wondering what was about to happen. Mrs. Thompson thought about all the times she told her students to stand up for what's right, to face injustice with dignity and courage. Now, standing in her own doorway, she was living those lessons. Her son had always said that change happens when good people refuse to back down from what's right. The sound of screeching tires echoed through the neighborhood. Mrs. Thompson allowed herself a small smile. Her son had always been protective of her, ever since he was a little boy. Now, as one of the city's most prominent civil rights attorneys, he had the power to protect not just her, but others who faced similar situations. The officer's demeanor was about to change dramatically, and Mrs. Thompson knew it. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice was simply holding your ground until help arrived. And help was definitely arriving. The screech of tires announced his arrival before anyone saw him. Mrs. Thompson's son's car came to a precise stop in the driveway, the engine's purr cutting through the tense evening air. Even before he stepped out, his presence seemed to change the atmosphere on the front porch. The car door opened with purpose, and out stepped a tall figure in a perfectly pressed suit. Despite having likely rushed from an important meeting, he moved with the calculated precision of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. His phone was already raised, recording everything. "Mom," he called out, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned from countless courtroom victories. "Don't move. Stay exactly where you are." He approached with measured steps, his free hand raised to show he carried nothing threatening. The older officer turned to face him, hands still resting on his belt. "Sir, this is a police matter. You need to step back." "Actually," Mrs. Thompson's son replied, his voice calm but firm, "this is a matter of civil rights violation occurring on private property." He positioned himself where both officers were clearly visible in his phone's recording. "I'm a civil rights attorney, and that's my mother you're harassing. I'd like your badge numbers, names, and an explanation of probable cause." The younger officer's posture changed immediately, his earlier aggression melting into uncertainty. The older one, however, tried to maintain his authoritative stance. "We receive reports of suspicious activity." "Suspicious activity?" Mrs. Thompson's son cut in, his voice carrying the same teaching tone his mother had used for decades. "You mean an elderly woman tending to her award-winning roses? The same roses she's been growing since before you wore that badge." More neighbors had gathered now, forming a semicircle of witnesses. Mrs. Rivera stepped forward, her phone still recording. "I have the whole thing on video," she called out. "From the moment they started harassing Mrs. Thompson." The retired judge, Mr. Wilson, moved closer as well. As a former judge, I can tell you this is a clear case of harassment. There was no probable cause, no warrant, and no legitimate reason to threaten a respected member of our community. Mrs. Thompson watched as her son seamlessly took control of the situation. He hadn't raised his voice once, but his presence filled the entire front yard. This was why he'd become a civil rights attorney, to protect people like his mother from exactly this kind of treatment. Officers, he continued, I'm going to need your supervisor here immediately. I'm also going to need incident reports filed, with badge numbers clearly listed. He glanced at his phone, then back at the officers. The timestamp on this video shows you've been here for 17 minutes, harassing my mother without cause. The older officer's hand finally moved away from his belt. Sir, we were responding to a call. A call about suspicious activity. Let's be very clear about what happened here. Mrs. Thompson's son moved slightly closer, his phone steady. You saw an elderly black woman in an upscale neighborhood and made assumptions. Those assumptions led you to harass a respected retired teacher in her own home, a woman who has lived here for over 3 decades. The evening breeze carried the scent of roses across the scene, a gentle reminder of what Mrs. Thompson had actually been doing before this all started. She stood a little straighter in her doorway, drawing strength from her son's presence and the support of her neighbors. I can see at least 8 witnesses recording this interaction. Her son continued, his legal training evident in every word. I've already started drafting a formal complaint in my head. But what happens next depends entirely on your next actions. The sound of another police car approaching filled the air. Mrs. Thompson recognized the pattern of the siren. It was the supervisor's car, the same one that patrolled their neighborhood regularly. She had often waved to that car while tending her garden. Her son turned to address all the neighbors who were recording. Thank you all for being here. Your witness is invaluable. Then he looked back at the officers, his expression professional but determined. Now shall we discuss how this situation could have been handled properly? The younger officer was already reaching for his radio, likely calling in to explain the situation to his approaching supervisor. The older one stood rigid, perhaps realizing just how badly they had mishandled this situation. Mrs. Thompson felt a mix of relief and pride, relief that help had arrived, and pride in raising a son who fought for justice. The police supervisor's car pulled up smoothly, its lights casting blue shadows across Mrs. Thompson's carefully maintained lawn. The supervisor stepped out, a woman with gray-streaked hair and decades of experience written across her face. She took in the scene with one sweeping glance, the gathered neighbors with their phones, the 2 officers standing awkwardly by the roses, and Mrs. Thompson's son in his crisp suit, still recording everything. Lieutenant, Mrs. Thompson's son greeted her with professional courtesy. I believe we need to discuss the inappropriate conduct of your officers. His voice carried the same measured tone he used in courtrooms, firm but never aggressive. The lieutenant nodded, her expression grave. I know who you are, counselor. And I certainly know Mrs. Thompson. She turned to face the 2 officers. What exactly is going on here? The older officer started to speak, but Mrs. Thompson's son smoothly interrupted. If I may, Lieutenant, I have video evidence of the entire incident, as do several neighbors. I suggest we review that first to ensure complete accuracy. He played the recordings, starting with Mrs. Rivera's footage of the initial confrontation. The lieutenant's face darkened as she watched the officer's aggressive behavior toward an elderly woman who had simply been tending her garden. Mrs. Thompson, the lieutenant said, turning to address her directly. I want to personally apologize for this incident. I know you've been a pillar of this community for decades. This should never have happened. Still standing in her doorway, Mrs. Thompson straightened her cardigan with dignity. Thank you, Lieutenant. I would hope this becomes a learning opportunity for your department. Her son stepped forward, phone still recording. Speaking of learning opportunities, I've documented several violations of department policy and constitutional rights in just these few minutes of footage. For instance, he began methodically listing each violation, his voice calm but authoritative. The younger officer visibly wilted with each point, while his partner's face grew increasingly red. The lieutenant listened intently, occasionally nodding as she took notes on her department tablet. Furthermore, Mrs. Thompson's son continued, "We have multiple witnesses who can confirm that my mother was simply tending to her roses, the same roses that were featured in last month's community newsletter." He gestured to the beautiful flower bed that had inadvertently sparked this confrontation. Mr. Wilson, the retired judge, stepped forward. "Lieutenant, I've known Mrs. Thompson for 30 years. She's taught half the children in this neighborhood. This kind of treatment is not just inappropriate, it's potentially actionable." The gathering of neighbors had grown larger, but remained respectfully quiet, their phones still recording. The sense of community support was palpable in the evening air. The lieutenant turned back to her officers. "Both of you, wait in your patrol car. We'll discuss this back at the station." Her tone left no room for argument. As they walked away, she addressed Mrs. Thompson's son again. "Counselor, I assume you'll be filing a formal complaint." "That depends," he replied, lowering his phone but not stopping the recording. "I'd like to see immediate departmental action, training programs, policy reviews, and a clear commitment to preventing similar incidents." His words were chosen carefully, focused on systemic change rather than punishment. Mrs. Thompson finally stepped fully onto her porch, her dignity intact. "What matters to me is making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else in our community. No one should feel threatened in their own home while tending to their garden." The lieutenant nodded solemnly. "I'd like to work with both of you on implementing changes. Your experience and legal expertise could help us improve our community relations significantly." The evening breeze carried the sweet scent of roses across the yard, a reminder of how this incident had begun. Mrs. Thompson's son placed a protective hand on his mother's shoulder, his other hand still holding the phone that had documented everything. "We're willing to work with you, Lieutenant," he said, "but we'll need more than promises. We'll need action, accountability, and real change." He glanced at the neighbors still recording. "Our community is watching, and they're ready to stand up for what's right." The sense of victory wasn't just personal, it was communal. Every person holding a phone, every neighbor standing in solidarity, they were all part of something bigger than a single incident. They were part of positive change in action. As the patrol cart carrying the two officers pulled away, the atmosphere in Mrs. Thompson's front yard began to shift. The tension that had filled the air just moments ago was replaced by a sense of community coming together. Neighbors who had stood witness with their phones now approached with concern and support. The lieutenant remained on scene, taking detailed statements from everyone present. Mrs. Rivera, still holding her phone, shared her complete video recording. "I started filming the moment I heard their aggressive voices," she explained, her hands trembling slightly with leftover adrenaline. Something just didn't feel right about how they were treating our Mrs. Thompson. Mrs. Thompson's son stood protectively near his mother, his legal training evident in how he ensured everything was properly documented. "Mom, would you like to go inside and sit down?" he asked softly, noticing how she kept adjusting her cardigan, a nervous habit she'd had for years. "Not just yet," she replied, her teacher's dignity shining through. "I want to thank our neighbors who stood by me." She looked at the gathered crowd, recognizing faces she'd known for decades. This is what community means. The Young family, who had recently moved in next door, stepped forward. "Mrs. Thompson, we're so sorry this happened to you," the wife said, holding her young daughter's hand. "Your roses were one of the reasons we chose this house. We would watch you gardening when we came to view the property, and we knew this was a neighborhood where people cared." The lieutenant was efficiently organizing the aftermath, her experience showing in how she handled the situation. "Mrs. Thompson, I'd like to take your formal statement when you're ready. And counselor," she turned to Mrs. Thompson's son, "I've already contacted Internal Affairs. They're expecting your call tomorrow morning." Mr. Wilson, the retired judge, had been quietly observing everything. Now he spoke up, his judicial experience adding weight to his words. "Lieutenant, I trust you'll ensure this incident receives proper attention. We can't have officers profiling our residents while they're simply living their lives." Mrs. Thompson's son nodded in agreement. "This needs to be more than just a written report filed away somewhere. We need real changes in training and accountability." His phone was still recording, capturing every moment of the resolution. The evening light was starting to fade, casting long shadows across Mrs. Thompson's beloved rose garden. The flowers that had inadvertently sparked this incident still bloomed beautifully, seemingly untouched by the tension that had surrounded them. "You know," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice carrying the wisdom of her years, "I've always told my students that difficult moments can become opportunities for positive change. Maybe this is one of those moments." Her son smiled, recognizing the teaching tone she had used countless times in her classroom. "Mom, you're still educating people, even in retirement." He turned to the lieutenant. "We'd like to see this incident used as a case study in your department's training programs. Real examples have more impact than theoretical scenarios." The neighbors began sharing their contact information with Mrs. Thompson's son, ensuring he had multiple witness accounts for his documentation. The sense of solidarity was palpable. This wasn't just about one incident, but about protecting their community. Mrs. Thompson finally allowed herself to sit in her porch chair, the same spot where she often enjoyed her morning coffee. The lieutenant approached with notepad in hand, ready to take her statement. "Take your time, Mrs. Thompson. I want to ensure we get every detail correctly documented." As she began recounting the events, her son stood nearby, still recording. The neighbors remained present, their support unwavering. This wasn't just about making a statement, it was about standing up for dignity, respect, and the right to feel safe in your own home. The sweet scent of roses drifted through the evening air, now carrying a different meaning. These flowers, which Mrs. Thompson had tenderly cared for over decades, had become symbols of resilience and community strength. Sometimes, she thought, the most beautiful things can grow from the most challenging situations. 2 weeks after the incident, Mrs. Thompson's garden was hosting a very different kind of gathering. Community members, police department representatives, and local officials had come together for what her son called a community bridge-building meeting. The roses were in full bloom, their sweet fragrance adding a touch of grace to the serious discussions taking place. The police chief himself had come to present the department's new action plan. "What happened here was unacceptable," he acknowledged, standing near the very spot where the confrontation had occurred. "But thanks to Mrs. Thompson and her son's advocacy, we're making real changes in how we train our officers." Mrs. Thompson sat in her favorite garden chair, watching as her front yard became a space for positive change. The 2 officers who had harassed her were now facing disciplinary action, but more importantly, they were required to undergo extensive community relations training. "The thing about teaching," Mrs. Thompson shared with the gathered crowd, "is that sometimes the most important lessons come from our mistakes." She smoothed her cardigan, a gesture that now carried a touch of confidence rather than nervousness. "What matters is how we learn from those mistakes." Her son stood nearby, his legal notepad filled with action items and commitments from the police department. The changes were substantial: mandatory cultural sensitivity training, community engagement programs, and a new civilian oversight committee. But perhaps most significantly, Mrs. Thompson had been invited to share her experience during police training sessions. "Your story has already made a difference," the lieutenant said, approaching with a document in hand. 3 other precincts have requested our new training program. They want to prevent similar incidents in their communities. The young family from next door had brought refreshments, and their little girl was carefully carrying a plate of cookies to share. "Mrs. Thompson," she said shyly, "can you teach me about roses too?" "Mommy says yours are the prettiest in the whole neighborhood." Mrs. Thompson smiled warmly. "Of course, dear. You know, roses need 3 things to grow strong: good soil, plenty of sunshine, and a community that cares for them." She glanced meaningfully at the gathered crowd. "Just like people." Her son was discussing the implementation of new policies with the police chief. "We need to ensure these changes stick," he insisted. "This isn't just about one incident, it's about transforming how law enforcement interacts with our community." The retired judge, who had witnessed the original confrontation, nodded in agreement. "What happened here could have ended very differently," he observed. "Instead, it's become a catalyst for positive change." Mrs. Rivera, who had recorded the initial incident, was now helping to document the community meeting. "Look how many people came," she said, panning her camera across the yard. "This is what happens when we stand together." As the evening progressed, Mrs. Thompson watched her garden transform from a place of confrontation to one of reconciliation. Children played near the roses while adults engaged in serious discussions about community policing. The very spot where she had felt threatened now hosted conversations about hope and change. "You know," she said to her son during a quiet moment, "sometimes the best gardens grow from the most challenging soil." She touched one of her prize roses gently. "These flowers have taught me that beauty can emerge from any situation if we nurture it properly." The police chief approached them one last time before leaving. "Mrs. Thompson, your grace in handling this situation has taught us all something valuable. Your roses may have started this story, but your dignity and wisdom are what will help us write a better ending." As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the gathering, Mrs. Thompson looked around at her community, neighbors, law enforcement, and local leaders all working together for change. The incident that had started with fear and discrimination had blossomed into something beautiful, a commitment to understanding, respect, and positive transformation. "Sometimes," she said to the remaining guests, "the most important growth happens after the storm." She smiled at her son, who had fought so hard for justice, and at her neighbors, who had stood with her in solidarity. And the strongest gardens are those tended by an entire community.